Go live. Yeah, now we're live. There we go. Thank you. Thank you for that. Good. Good. Everything looks good there. Everything looks good. That needs to be closed. There. Good. Maybe that's why the Nightbot wasn't working. Over here. Let's see. Oh, I was gonna
Fuck the police! They can't control! We gotta take it back! Everyone get up and let's go!
Yeah, okay, so that works. Just not getting any of the timers. Should have gotten one of the timers to tick by now, but that's all right. That's all right. It really doesn't matter all that much. What matters is that you're here and I'm here, and we are going to talk about some philosophy today. But I'll start off by giving everybody a heads up. It will be kind of a short stream today. I plan to get through the entirety of the video. We have the next Anarch video in the series. Why is that? Oh, that's why. It's because that's showing it the right way. Right. Which is going to be the 6th. Yeah, 6th in the series. When I started to play on last stream, oh, you all can't see me because I hid me. Right, but I started to play last stream. I need to also get rid of the coming soon. Pro streamer here, y'all. There we go. Fixed it. Yeah, I saw that, Kai Matara. I was going to make an announcement about that too. As Kai Matara has pointed out, let me bring it over here so I can point it. They had to start a new Substack. It completely glitched out. When you changed your email. My old articles are still up on the old one, but I'll be posting to this one from now on, and people will have to resubscribe here. I have already resubscribed. It's in right. It is in the Discord. I think I have it right here too. Yeah. That one should be the correct one, I think. Good. Will you republish the articles that you had previously published on the old account? Will you republish those ones on the new account? Or just start fresh? Oh yeah, short stream. So last night I was at somebody's house for a get together where we were all eating and enjoying libations. And I found out last night that there's another thing going on today that I've been invited to that I would like to go to, but it starts like it starts in about 2 hours, but I'm not going to be there right when it starts. Obviously, I'm going to finish up with stream first. We'll get through our video, do a regular stream. I suspect we'll stream for about 2 hours, but then I'll cut out so I can make it to my friend's event that's going on this evening. Definitely I'll be republishing my favorite ones there. Good. Yeah, I think that's a really good idea because you've got a lot of really good work, and it'll be confusing to try and if people don't know, it'll be confusing, I think. Good. Good. So, I don't really have any other announcements or things that I wanted to talk about. Did you all have a good break? Because most of you probably don't have to work. I would imagine. Jane doesn't ever work, so that's good. But how did you all have a good day yesterday? Did you do anything? Did you have any kinds of celebrations or lamentations or the new thing is, oh, I meant to have this pulled up. National Day of Mourning. That's yeah, let me go ahead and pull this up.
Hello and greetings to my sisters and brothers on the day of mourning. I can happily say, because of your hard work and support over the years, that I'm now sitting in my own personal home, pretty nice little home that was bought for me by Indian people, not tribes.
Yeah, so this is a pretty good little clip. I liked it an awful lot. I like the idea of changing the language around it and the way that we think about it and the way that we remember the holiday. If it's going to be a national holiday, which it still is, then we should speak truth as much as we can to the significance and the reality, the real reasons why the holiday exists, and it was created to cover up a massacre, right? Which Leonard will talk about here. So sharing this in the chat so you all can go check it out. Please follow the link and go ahead and click like, right? So you can support our comrade, Leonard Peltier, who's finally been released. But yeah, I also enjoyed lots of great food. That's really all right. So the group of people that I was with is really kind of diverse, and by that I mean, it's people from all over the country, places all around the world, from all kinds of different walks of life. And nobody really cared very much about any kind of Thanksgiving tradition, right? It was just an opportunity for us to come together as a community and to break bread together and to just enjoy each other's company. So that's what I was doing, and we'll be doing a little bit more of this later this evening. White liberals should have been uncomfortable yesterday. Right. Yes. Should have been extremely uncomfortable everywhere. Yeah. But that's the thing. Like, they still get their parade. They still get their Black Friday shit that, I imagine that lots of people went ahead and spent a whole bunch of money today, even though there was supposed to be a boycott for Black Friday. And I told my friend that I'm meeting up with today, or I haven't told them yet, but I will when I see them later today, that I'm showing up empty-handed because I'm not going to go to the store and buy something, and I didn't know that this was going on previously. I don't have time to prepare anything. I made some sweet potato casserole last night, and I left the dish over at my other friend's house, so I can't even take the leftovers to tonight. Which is too bad, but that's okay. Yeah. Folks are still very colonized. Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And there's still so much that those white liberals are insulated by layers and layers and layers of white supremacist mythology, colonizer mythology. It's just so thick. But, you know, I believe that we are making headway with regard to this, with changing public conceptions, right? I would say that like 10 or 15 years ago, Columbus Day was still kind of a bit of a struggle, a bit of a fight, that people still didn't really want to let go of it. And we've reached a point now where anybody who is arguing about the merits of Columbus Day are clearly just asshole bigots who are ignorant, who are determined to remain ignorant despite all of the overwhelming evidence. But right, so I believe that with the quote unquote Thanksgiving holiday, or National Day of Mourning, which I think is a much more appropriate thing for the yesterday's event to be called. What was I saying? Mid-sentence, I forgot what I was talking about. I know the subject that I'm talking about. I forgot what that sentence was how that sentence was gonna end. In the middle of that sentence. Every day should be mourning day. Right. We are on stolen land, and every day that we are on stolen land, there should be constant reminders of that reality. I think that's a true statement. Oh, for sure. But let's go ahead and get the video because it's kind of short, relative. The one that we watched on Wednesday was longer by about 10 minutes, but I expect that this one's also going to take a bit to get through, because horizontal organizing is it's a nerd thing that I love to talk about, so it's going to probably be a bit kind of difficult for me to not pause this one and say a whole bunch of stuff. So let's get the video going so that we can be sure to get through the whole thing today.
Hey everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. In this episode, I'm going to be continuing this lecture series I've been doing where I summarize my longer video essays into a more digestible format. And the topic of today's video is going to be a summary of part 4 of A Modern Anarchism, titled Organization. This video is, as of yet, unreleased. However, the script is basically finished, so I figure I can create this part of the lecture series ahead of time, and as a bonus, it's kind of a sneak preview for some of you who are here for the video essays about what the sorts of topics are going to be of that next video essay. So if you're interested in learning about organization from an anarchist perspective, utilizing things like systems theory and cybernetics, then you should stick around because that's going to be the topic of today's video. I should also mention, before we get started, that if you want to support the work that I'm doing on this channel, you should go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. You can also become a member on YouTube, and all of the same tiers are there. If you become a patron or a member on YouTube for any amount, you get access to the Anarch Discord server. Don't forget to go into settings and add the integration for Discord there. Also, just know that 5% of my Patreon income every single month is donated straight to the group Cooperation Tulsa. Cooperation Tulsa is a social ecologist and communalist organization here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if you'd like to learn more about what they're doing, you can go over to the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube channel, which we have only just recently created. Or you can find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. We have a page there. So go over and subscribe to the Cooperation Tulsa social media. But that's it for the opening spiel. Let's get started on the video. So what I'm setting out to do in part 4 of A Modern Anarchism is basically create a consistent theory of organization that utilizes the most up-to-date systems science in order to understand how we are going to organize our organizations instead. There are a variety of ways that I could have approached a problem like that, but what I did is I started with what is called viable systems theory. Viable systems theory is a framework that was created by Stafford Beer, and it was his attempt to create a unified understanding of how all systems in the universe function, and to create what he considered the 5 basic functions that any of those systems must have in order to remain viable. That is to say, to self-perpetuate themselves into the future. And I should mention, this topic of viability is actually one that I visit earlier in the series of video essays called A Modern Anarchism. In part 2, when I'm introducing complex systems analysis, I talk about something called autopoiesis. So autopoiesis is the ability of some system to perpetuate itself into the future. This includes the ability for it to survive, but it also includes things like reproduction. It is essentially where a system makes something like itself, whether that is the reproduction of itself or copies of itself. I bring this up right off the bat because autopoiesis is a base requirement for anything that exists in the universe to continue existing. That is to say, for any system to actually have an effect on the world around it, to be part of various other systems, it must be autopoietic. Things that are not autopoietic do not perpetuate into the future, almost ipso facto, basically from first principles. This means that we have to create autopoietic or viable systems, as Stafford Beer calls them. So Stafford Beer's framework is going to be useful for us. It gives us some basic requirements that we have to meet if we are going to have a viable system. Stafford Beer doesn't name these 5 systems, but I'm going to name them as we proceed because I think it might help you understand which is which. So I've called System 1 implementation, and that is because that is essentially what System 1 is. It is the ability of some broader system to carry out practical implementation on the ground. This is the aspect of the system that does things on a daily basis, that makes sure the basic tasks get done. In the body, System 1 might be things like your hands. It might also include your ability to speak. It's essentially what carries out all of the tasks that the rest of the system has decided in one way or another are going to get done. System 2 I call communications, and that's because, once again, that's essentially what this system does. It communicates between all of the internal parts of the system. That includes communications between each of the various forms of System 1, but it also includes communications between other parts of the broader system that we are going to get to here in a moment. In your body, that's probably best compared to something like your nervous system. The third system is what I call tactics. And some of these later systems, 3, 4, and 5, were kind of difficult to name because they are bigger than the words I might be using. However, this one's still pretty close. Tactics are basically our ability to coordinate plans on the ground about how we're going to carry things out. So it's not just the communication between various parts of the System 1, it is instead what kinds of things we might have System 1 do. System 3 is tasked with maintaining consistency of implementation. Next, we have System 4, which I've titled Strategy. And here I just want to delineate, for those who are maybe not familiar, the difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy is an overall plan that you have with your implementation, whereas tactics is the exact way you're going to carry out all of the specific parts of that plan. So, for example, a general might have a broader strategy, which is aimed at claiming a piece of territory, but the tactics would be the exact ways they plan on actually conquering that territory.
So there's a really good article that we talked about on stream months ago, which is going to do a great job of talking about this difference between tactics and strategy. I might have what it was Gelderloos. What was the work called? How nonviolence supports the state, I think is what it was called. How Nonviolence Protects the State by Peter Gelderloos. So I'm going to drop this in chat again. Here, if I get the things. There's a way to do an anchor. Yeah, this is where we want. I think. And put a slash there. Oh, it won't do that because I don't have the. Yeah, I don't know. Thing is. That's okay. But the here, let me drop this link in chat. That's definitely not the button I was trying to put. There we go. And over there on YouTube as well. Good. Yeah, this is we spent, I want to say that we spent 2 or 3 weeks talking about this particular work, but we were focused mostly on the ways that nonviolent strategies in general and distinguishing those from different forms of direct action or different forms of dissent, which right, there's lots of distinctions to be made there, and that's why we spent days unpacking all of those distinctions. But yeah, that's helpful too. A helpful reference for understanding that difference between tactics and strategy. And that's the chapter or section is in that work where Gelderloos talks about it specifically is here, I'll just move that over there. Excuse me. Nonviolence is tactically and strategically inferior. There is some more stuff that I wanted to talk about with regard to this Gelderloos piece, so we probably will come back and address it. Because there was some pushback that I wanted to give with regard to this, but you know, that was a long time ago, and we've been distracted with a whole lot of other topics between now and then. But check it out.
So that is what System 4 is concerned with, the broader plan of how things are going to proceed on a long term. Strategy is important. It is thinking about the future and thinking about possible hurdles that will come up. You might notice as well that starting here at about System 4, these are things that are generally relegated to people in administrative or leadership positions in hierarchical power. We will address the difference in how these systems are handled in a horizontal system here in a moment. lastly, we have System 5, and I've called System 5 Vision. However, it also comprises, to a large degree, decision-making about all of the rules and norms of the system itself. That includes the
Thank you
rules
for
and
the
norms
follow.
for everything within all of the other systems. So this is the place where the strategies are often developed, and the vision that guides those strategies is developed. So in a hierarchical system, this is generally going to be something that CEOs and people higher up in the chain of command are carrying out. In other words, not just a strategy of how we're going to get somewhere, but also where we want to go. So as I lay out these 5 systems, I just want to emphasize that Stafford Beer has no conception that these have to be compartmentalized away from one another. I think that's an easy misunderstanding to make. In fact, Stafford Beer says that systems often function best when these are not compartmentalized away from one another, but are instead integrated into various parts of the system, as well as being repeated at various scales. However, clearly it's not the case that every single one of these can be carried out by everyone all the time. This is unfortunately what leads to specialization of labor, and often it leads to specialization wherein there are administrators and bosses and leaders of various kinds who command others. In a conventional business, for example, we see that System 1 is largely the workers, with sometimes System 2 being comprised of workers as well. But starting at about System 3, tactics, we start to get into different kinds of managerial and administrative positions. System 3 is usually handled by some kind of floor manager or store manager who makes sure that the company's rules and values are maintained within the activity of the workers. One might also notice that System 2 communication is often held by some kind of assistant manager, maybe also things like HR. These often function as forms for internal communication. System 4, or strategy, is usually going to be handled by people who are higher up this chain of executives, starting to get to people like regional managers or even the board of directors. And System 5 is usually going to be handled by people that own the company, say the CEO or your boss in a smaller company. However, in a lot of very large companies, System 5 is pretty much exclusively going to be the shareholders. The shareholders direct most of the vision of the companies that they own, especially those who are sitting on the board of directors. However, it depends on the company how much of System 5 or vision is determined by the shareholders or some trusted CEO. So it's understandable how when you hear these 5 systems, you start to imagine a sort of traditionally hierarchical system along with its specialization of different administrative functions.
Well, what I was about to say, I've been thinking about pausing it for about 20 seconds, is that the way that Anarch has framed these and introduced these and set them up has been breadcrumbing us along a conception which would lead us to imagine these organizational standards as being hierarchical, but they don't necessarily have to be. But I completely understand why Anarch would have done this, because it's going to make for breadcrumbing is actually very helpful in a lot of ways. In this, it's a good way to introduce this kind of idea, especially because if you try to re-envision it the other way, or if you try to introduce the concept for people who don't know anything about flat structures or horizontal organizing, or have seen any examples of them, or are aware of how they work as companies, right? There are horizontal companies which exist, And if you're not familiar with any of those kinds of things, then you have no point of reference for understanding how these systems are supposed to work together to help. Well, these pillars are supposed to work together to maintain the system itself. But we'll get there. That's going to be the point. Is now that we have this conception of how these different aspects function together, or ought to function, or do function in a hierarchical system. Now let's break that down. Let's deconstruct that and see what we're left with.
However, a big part of what I'm laying out in part 4 of A Modern Anarchism is that this is really not necessary. There are alternatives that help us overcome these burdens. But as I said, all 5 of these functions have to be carried out in either a hierarchical or a horizontal system, because all systems have to meet these basic standards of viability. So one of the ways that a horizontal system can meet these standards, if it is necessary to have compartmentalization, is through something called delegation. And delegation is where we assign somebody to do a role on a temporary and revocable basis. And they're given a mandate, which is decided by all of the people within the horizontal organization. This is different from how hierarchical organizations do it in 2 different ways. One is that in a hierarchical organization, these positions are structurally locked. There has to be somebody in the supervisor position. There has to be somebody in the boss position. There has to be somebody on the board of trustees, and so on. However, in a horizontal organization, all power roots to the base. That is to say, all of the workers, or the people in the organization as it may be, are the ones who actually make all decisions about delegation. If they find that it's needed to have some kind of person in a supervisor position who helps coordinate between the workers, they can elect a delegate to do that. And they can lay out precisely what it is that that delegate is allowed to do. That doesn't have to include things like hiring and firing, which can still be held by the broader workplace. But it could include the ability to coordinate people together from different parts of the floor or different parts of the organization in order to get tasks done. It could also involve things like logistics, ordering items, making sure that certain people are at certain places at certain times. However, if it were found that somebody in this position were not doing this position correctly, the workplace could simply vote to revoke their position entirely and reabsorb all of those powers back into the Council of People.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't need oversight committees. We don't need bosses and managers and governors and the state. We don't need some other entity who's over and above us to make sure that we can just interact with each other fairly and hold each other accountable. That's the point, is that we learn how to hold each other accountable in direct ways, as members of a responsible community, right? Is that we don't have some separate entity whose job it is to be responsible for us. We are responsible for us, and it's up to us to pay attention to when somebody isn't doing the things that they had agreed to, and figure out what we are going to do about that as a community, right? As a group of people, we can come together with that person who is not succeeding and figure out a way to help them succeed, or to give somebody else that role or position that is going to be successful in that role or position, right? We just do that, and we don't need bosses and managers or somebody else to come in and make these decisions. We need to learn how to be responsible about making these kinds of decisions.
This is a really important distinction between representation, which is the hierarchical function that I noted a moment ago, and delegation, which is what I'm currently describing. Essentially, what I'm laying out here is that you can determine whether an organization is hierarchical or horizontal to a large degree based on how decision-making is made and how implementation takes place. In a hierarchical organization, those who make the decisions and those who implement them are generally a different group of people, and those who make decision are generally a minority of the overall organization, while the people who implement their decisions are a majority of that organization. This is to say, mandates about implementation are determined by people in those structurally locked roles, and those structurally locked roles are a minority of the total organization. By contrast, in a horizontal organization, all decisions are made by the body of people in the organization themselves. They then determine the mandate for any person they delegate, and then the people who have been delegated carry out specific tasks. This is highly flexible. That is to say that you could delegate one person to a task, you could delegate 2 or 3 or 4, you could even delegate almost the entire organization to the task. And that delegation would be temporary, based on the task that is being carried out, and revocable. That is to say their position could be taken away from them at the whim of the total organization. I bring all of this up about the form of delegation, this separation between decision-making and implementation, because next I'd like to talk about how we are going to institute the 5 systems of Stafford Beer's viable systems theory into a horizontal organization. So, in a horizontal organization, as you may have inferred from some of the description that I just gave, all 5 systems lie within the general assembly of people within the organization by default. I say by default because it may be that they decide on the scope of a mandate for a delegate that will handle one or another of these systems, or as it may be, numerous delegates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 5 systems and I'm going to talk about how each of these are generally delegated, both in practice and in theory. So starting with System 1, implementation, or the on-the-ground practice of carrying out decisions, this one is actually the most common to delegate in horizontal organizations. In fact, we even have a formal name for it. We call them working groups. So let's use Cooperation Tulsa as an example. So in Cooperation Tulsa, we function precisely like I've described so far. We have a general council of the membership who comes together and makes all decisions. Then we delegate people to specific tasks, or we create working groups. So Cooperation Tulsa owns 2.5 acres of land. And what we decided was, it's not necessary for our general council meetings to spend all of their time deciding on every detail about what is done out at Flat Rock. Instead, what we did was we delegated a working group to make smaller scale decisions about what takes place at Flat Rock. And I know you might be hearing this and thinking, well, couldn't that working group start having runaway power? Yeah, that's possible, but that would likely come from us not determining the scope of the mandate of the working group correctly. So, for example, if what we had done was determined that this working group had the power to make all decisions about what takes place at Flat Rock, then yeah, it could have turned out to be kind of dangerous. But that's not what the mandate of the working group is. Instead, the mandate of the working group is just that they are able to carry out the day-to-day implementation of the decisions that were already made in the General Council. That is to say, the General Council lays out the vision and the strategy and the tactics we would like to see implemented at Flat Rock, and then that forms the scope of the mandate for that working group. So by the time the working group begins doing things on the ground, the scope of the things that the working group might actually do, the sorts of decisions that it might make, are very constrained and are basically contained within the mandate of their delegation. delegation. This means they can't really make any decisions that were not already intended by the council to begin with. It also means that they are always ultimately accountable to the council. If that working group were to start doing some things that we suspected were not good, we could simply revoke the delegation of the working group and abolish it completely and decide to make all of those decisions in the general council now instead. In practice, this tends to be kind of flexible. It doesn't even always require us to revoke delegation. Sometimes it's just necessary that we make larger scale decisions about what takes place with Flat Rock in the general council again, especially when those decisions concern the scope of the mandate that we passed to begin with. So that is to say, generally, if questions about Flat Rock reach the level of systems 4 or 5, that is to say strategy or vision, they tend to end up being decided by the council again. But we'll get to that here in a second. Let's move on to delegating System 2. Remember, System 2 is communications, and that's internal communications. Internal communications are often handled by somebody who is in a sort of secretary position or an in-reach coordinator of some sort. However, it should also be noted that digital means also constitute System 2. Things like Signal or Discord are means for us to communicate between all of the parts of the inside of our organization. So that's the form that the delegation generally takes. That is to say, someone whose job it is to do in-reach to the rest of the people in the organization, make sure everything's all right, try to ensure some group cohesion, as well as just to make sure that everybody is carrying out the things they agreed to in the meetings and actually meeting the tasks of their mandate, and also digital platforms that are used for that internal communication. This also counts as a form of delegating System 2. Moving on to System 3, System 3 tends to be something that is carried out on the ground in my...
How do we account for external communication, which is also going to be necessary? I think, right, that there's, for any group or power or organization to persist, it has to be able to interact with the outside world, with the other things. It needs, right, I'm not sure where that falls. I imagine it's going to be explained. So we'll put a pin in that for now.
Experience. That is to say, tactics are generally going to be considered by the working groups. They don't decide everything about tactics. Instead, the way it often functions in a horizontal organization is that the working group, by the time they're doing something on the ground, they sort of have a palette. You know how like a painter has a palette where all their paints are? And they sort of choose from the palette which of these they are going to use in practice. But the palette is determined by the general council of members. In my general experience, this works out pretty well. It allows a considerable amount of flexibility for people who are doing the implementation, while still allowing us to revise our tactics at a future time in the general council of the membership. As for Systems 4, Strategy, and System 5, Vision, that is something we generally keep to the general council. However, certain aspects of System 4 may be delegated. For example, we have before created a working group that is about strategy. That is to say, a place where we just discuss the strategy we would like to carry out in the future. However, it's important to note, once again, that this working group was given a mandate with a scope. And that mandate says that they don't get to make decisions about the strategy we are going to carry out. Their purpose is to deliberate about what kinds of strategies the group should carry forth. So in that sense, this System 4 delegation really just ends up being a kind of study group and discussion group where we sit around and we have discussions about what we think the group's strategy should be. Then we take those discussions back to the General Council and we sort of consult with the rest of the General Council about the sorts of things that we discussed in that strategy working group. And this sort of brings us now to System 5, which is vision. And I feel like I should note here, I kind of left something out about System 5. System 5 is named Vision for a second reason. Not only is it tasked with figuring out the overall vision of the organization itself, but it is also the system wherein there is vision of the outside world. So remember how System 2 is internal communication. Well, System 5 is external communication. So System 5 is in constant feedback with the environment that it is within. This means that System 5 is in the constant process of looking outwards, thinking about what is to be done, and trying to develop the broader vision of the organization based on what it has learned from the outside.
That makes a lot of sense. That it's and that's what I was trying to think of when Anarch first introduced the list. He mentioned communication, and I assumed that was going to entail internal communication and also the exchange of ideas from internal to external communication. But there is a great value for there being an extra layer of filter between those two, because the conversation with the outside world is part of establishing the identity of the group itself, right? And think about your identity, right? You as a group of organs, as an organism, right? As a group of different things that are all traveling through the world as one unity. You determine to a great extent what your image is, right? How you present your gender or your sexuality or other aspects of your identity. But as we've talked about, you don't have total control over those things. You get to project and to perform, but you don't get to tell other people what to take away from your performance. Right? And so this part is in the vision section where, right, there's a vision, an overall vision for the overarching project that is, a reflection inward, but also present about how it's viewed by the external, and working with that relationship to establish the identity of an organism or organization, that later it can go back and do some internal tooling, right? But it can change the vision as it needs to change the vision, and then the retooling of the internal communication is a separate, independent thing that has an extra layer of insulation there between those, which, again, I think does make a lot of sense for many reasons. Good.
So System 5 is actually very complex. And for that reason, System 5 is almost entirely contained in the General Council, and it may be very important that System 5 never actually be delegated. In fact, what is in System 5 is essentially that which should always be decided by the General Council of members. The membership should themselves come together and determine what the vision of the organization is. And that would include things like updating our charter or passing a new charter. That would include things like doing social insertion, going to other organizations' meetings, and doing report backs about that. It would include having discussions about what we would like the direction of the group to be. When all is said and done, and much of these other systems have been delegated in one form or another, this is what the sorts of discussions in the General Council usually take the form of. So that's the 5 systems in a horizontal structure. In my experience, Stafford Beer is correct. You do need all 5 of these functions in order for your system to be viable. And many non-viable organizations that I've been in have been ones where they either do not properly delegate one or another of these functions, or they don't even do one or another of these functions. I've found that the more informal the organization is, the more it tends to focus its entire mind on System 1, implementation, doing rather than thinking. And you can hear this sentiment being expressed among a lot of organizers. People who say that we need to do and stop talking, people who hate meetings about meetings, and so on. I think these people are right to be averse to having meetings about meetings. You obviously should not just be sitting there talking about what you talked about. You should be figuring out how it is that you are going to implement what you talked about. However, only having System 1 means that your structure is non-viable. It's not going to respond well to new stressors and variety. You need to be able to communicate between the internal parts of your organization. You need to be able to plan and reform your tactics. You need to be able to develop a long-term strategy, and you need to know what the overall vision of your organization is. If you don't have all of these at the same time, then your System 1 or implementation is really just going to fall to pieces as it fails to overcome the hurdles that confront it. So that's the topic of viability and how we might actually create and manage a horizontal power structure. However, what I have not done is gotten into a bunch of specifics. For example, capacity. How might we actually look at the strategic landscape and make good decisions? How might we deal with internal conflicts? How do we successfully coordinate with other organizations? These are the sorts of things that I think are probably not going to avail themselves to a short summary or one of these lecture videos, but I will make some kind of brief comments. One of the most important things that an organization can do is manage the capacity of its members. That is to say, the ability of its members to confront the tasks that are ahead of them without getting burned out. You don't want to work your organizers over capacity, but you also don't want to underwork them too much because then you're not meeting your potentials. So the ideal is to work just below everybody's capacity. And by like full capacity or 100% capacity here, I'm not talking about that capacity where you push yourself as hard as is conceivably possible. I'm talking about that capacity which you can do for a long period of time. I'm talking
something which is sustainable.
about your sustainable capacity. Because when people work themselves over capacity, that's when they tend to burn out. So a big part of the reason why you want to develop an organization is because it streamlines the decision-making process. It streamlines your ability to confront a variety of different obstacles at the tactical, strategic, and vision level, then to coordinate and make short-term, mid-term, and long-term plans. It's essentially a way to deliberately structure our decisions such that we make sure that we are keeping all of those plates spinning, while at the same time not overburdening all of our organizers. It should be said that capacity is not fixed. That is to say, people do not have the same capacity indefinitely. Their capacity can actually go up based on a variety of things. One of those is just, of course, that they have more time freed up to do organizing. Another one, however, is just that they are energized by successes. And I think this is a big one. You want to have this sort of slow trickle of successes such that people feel invigorated by what they've achieved. If you can do that, you'll find that people's capacity generally goes up. Another aspect, however, is in not taxing their capacity as much. That is to say, making it easier for them to interact with the organization and the world around them. I've coined this organizational ergonomics after a friend of mine brought this phrase up. That is to say, how easy is it to use the organization? The harder it is to use the organization, the more exhausting it's going to be. And the easier it is to use the organization, the less energy it's going to expend. All of these things are important in maintaining organizer capacity. So the last brief comment that I'll make before we close out the video is on the topic of strategy. So obviously strategy should emerge from circumstances, but there are some broad goals that we can keep in mind. For example, we should be trying to develop cooperative relationships with other horizontal organizations and coordinating our power together such that we are both stronger. Similarly, we should be trying to undermine and dismantle the hierarchical power structures around us and then sort of internalize the flows of power that they once had control over.
This is part of our roadmap. Remember from last stream? This is where we make federations with other horizontal groups. We form horizontal groups and then federate ourselves with other horizontal groups so that we can have greater combined power.
So that involves prefiguration. That is to say, we have to build our alternative power structures. But it also involves a form of conflict. That is to say, we must be in the process of constantly dismantling and undermining hierarchical power structures so that we can sort of predate these structures. What that looks like is decreasing the amount of leverage that hierarchical power has over the people in your area, both by lifting them up and helping them live, but also by helping them go to combat with these hierarchical power structures themselves in whatever form that might look like. That might be forming unions, that might be creating protests, that might be organizing direct action, that might involve sabotage. This combat can take a variety of different forms. And when you are choosing between these different forms, it's important that you think about blowback. Blowback is the negative consequences for the tactic or strategy that you have chosen. When you choose a tactic or strategy, you need to think about what these negative repercussions might look like on the exploited populace that it is you are trying to help go to combat. You don't want to escalate conditions further than they can handle. You want to make sure that you are lifting them up in equal measure, that you are bringing them to the front. Because if all you do is you spur people to combat, but they are unable to support themselves when they enter into the fray, then all you've done is made their lives worse, and you have in no appreciable way actually damaged the hierarchical power structure. It's important that your aggression is always matched by an equal fervor to protect the people that are being harmed by the prevailing hierarchical power structure that you are organizing them against. But I think that's about it for those last little notes. This is a broad overview of the sorts of topics that I'm going to be talking about in part 4 of A Modern Anarchism. Anyway, if you have enjoyed these lectures, and if you appreciate the work that I'm doing on this channel, in equal measure that you are bringing them to the front. Because if all you do is you spur people to combat, but they are unable to support them.
Yeah, I think that we can end the video there. I like that take. I think that I would put even more emphasis on the protection versus antagonism. That the way that the most successful way that we can be antagonistic, I believe, is by giving people real freedom. That is, by helping meet their needs, by protecting them, insulating them from the coercion of the state. That's the end goal, is for us to remove paywalls between people and their rights, the things that they actually have a right to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And all other forms of quote-unquote liberation that disguise themselves in state power. We need to develop a counter hegemony. Yes. And one that is focused on solidarity and protection while we are, and that's, we don't have to find ways to be antagonistic. if we are helping people be more free, we will be seen as aggressors, right? We will be seen as antagonistic because we'll be undermining the system. That's the best thing. Rather than to go to war with the system, undermine the system. That's something that we've talked about over and over and over again. That if you go to war with the state will just kill you. But if you undermine the state's power and authority such that people feel like the fascist police can or should no longer be allowed to just do what they do, then you've actually shifted the power. Then you've actually combated the state by undermining people's belief in its authority, their belief in its credibility as a just institution. And that's really, I think, one of the main drivers is just pointing out the ways that that the government just fails to meet all of those needs. The next video in the series is only 12 and a half minutes, and it's on building dual state power, or dual power. So I think that we should just roll right into it, because it's not a very long video, and I think it'll probably answer a lot of the remaining concerns and questions that I have right now anyway.
What is dual power? This phrase gets used a lot, but we don't ever really spend any time laying out what it is. And the short description I would give is just that it's the idea that we should make an alternative power structure while the prevailing structure continues to exist. It is essentially lowercase r revolution instead of capital R revolution. We're not trying to train up a militant vanguard and pick up arms and go to work just destroying the state and then hoping everything will just work out afterwards. Instead, the idea is that we create the alternative right here and right now. So what I'm really getting across here is that within our daily lives, we exist within a hierarchical society. All of the structures we exist within are hierarchical. And every time that we get some amount of power, it's because that power was given to us. We have some kind of intermediary that either allows us to have that power or not, and that usually only takes place when them giving us that power benefits them. What we're saying is that we want to create a horizontal power structure, and that it is going to develop its own capabilities, that it is going to develop its own self-reliance, its autonomy from hierarchy. So this is kind of related to the concept of direct action. Direct action is acting without intermediaries. Instead of begging for power from the power structures that be, we make our own power. And I think that this has to take place in 4 different sectors, you might say. I call these the 4 pillars of prefiguration. Those 4 pillars are councils, economics, defense, and intelligence. So let's just kind of run through those real quick. By councils, I'm talking about those bodies where we come together and we democratically make decisions together. We make proposals, we deliberate, we amend those proposals together, and then we act on them. And these can take all kinds of different forms. Our organizations are often a form of a council, but I think more specifically what I'm aiming at is something like a popular assembly or a general assembly, where we get people from some locality together and they make decisions about how they're going to solve their problems.
This is very similar to Iris Marion Young's idea of democratic cultural pluralism. I wrote an essay project on this a long time ago. So the idea of democratic cultural pluralism is that we create spaces for literally everyone and anyone to be able to be empowered to really be heard for their concerns or their ideas to be taken seriously by everyone that needs to that would be involved in that kind of concern, right? That we have spaces right now. Our public spaces for public grievance are extremely limited in the United States. There's not really much that you can do aside from standing on a corner on a soapbox with a bullhorn, right? To quote unquote be heard. There are not a lot of political mechanisms that you have access to where you will be heard by people who make the important decisions about your concern. And that's the kind of space that we need. With Iris Marion Young, she was talking specifically about leftist organizing and leftist organizers in their historical inability to create the kinds of spaces within their organizations that would allow dissenting voices to bring to everyone's concern that, hey, this movement is actually kind of sexist and we need to do something about the fact that women don't have any power or control or any say over the stuff that's going on, right? That there need to be some kinds of mechanisms, spaces in which, in those organizations in which people get to voice their concerns, to be taken seriously, to be protected, and to be empowered, right, in all of the important ways that it would matter. So I really love this idea. Makes a lot of sense.
The second category is economics, cooperatives, mutual aid networks. These allow us to provide for ourselves. The third one is defense, and defense can take many different forms. Obviously, when I use this word defense, probably a lot of things come to mind, most of them probably pretty militant, and those things are included in defense. So that would include people having arms training. That would include people knowing how to fight with their hands. But it would also include people knowing how to de-escalate violence as it takes place. It would also include going and doing harm reduction in our communities. It would also include teaching people how to be medics, for example. These are all forms of defending.
And legal defense. Legal protections. That's one of the things that I really admire about what's the group? It's an immigrant workers advocacy group, and I can't remember, but they're fantastic at that kind of thing, at organizing legal protections for demonstrators and protesters and organizers so that when the cops show up or when charges are pressed, there's legal recourse that those people have, and that those people know about their rights, they know about the protections that they have, and they understand the threats that they're under. Right, that they're not taken by surprise when they are arrested or when they have fines or they're taken to court for whatever reason, that they're prepared for those kinds of eventualities, and they know that there's a plan in place for those kinds of eventualities. I think that's really also an important part of defense is legal protections and knowledge, that the people know what their rights are and the ways in which they are protected and the ways in which they are vulnerable.
Our communities. The last one is intelligence, and I think this one is probably the least developed of any of these four pillars that I've discussed so far. Intelligence is our ability to do reconnaissance about the territory that we are in. It is our ability to gather information about how the enemy structures are functioning such that we can fight against them, undermine them, sabotage them, infiltrate them, and so on. And it indeed includes things like that, infiltrating those structures, doing spy work. But it also includes things like being an information clearinghouse for information that's harmful to those structures. So this may not be the most anarchistic example, but look at something like WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is a fully decentralized structure, and what it does is it takes information that is submitted to it that is harmful to these hierarchical structures that they want to keep secret, and it makes it public knowledge. That ability to make this public knowledge is a form of intelligence. So that may not seem like enough detail to really understand what is the dual power strategy. Well, imagine that what we're trying to do is we're trying to get more and more of the flows of power in society to be inside of those horizontal structures, in those four pillars of prefiguration that I just laid out. So imagine that what you have is the default state of society is hierarchy controls everything. Then what you have is arising within this hierarchical power structure, you have these horizontal structures begin to arise. These horizontal power structures, when they first start, are still going to have to receive some of their incoming power from those hierarchical structures, and they're going to act in the world with the power that they've gained there. But our idea is we're trying to reduce the amount of that. We're trying to, as quick as we conceivably can, reduce the amount of power that we get from hierarchical society. As that takes place, the hierarchical structure is going to realize that we're a threat. And it's hard to say when that's going to happen. In fact, you might say it's kind of always happening. It's kind of a graded process that just grows more and more extreme over time. So what that means is the state and corporations and white supremacy and patriarchy, all of these structures of hierarchy are going to start to fight back against us in varying ways of militancy and violence and subversion. When that takes place, we have to be prepared to be self-reliant, not just as individuals, even though individual self-reliance is good, and not just as singular organizations, even though it's also good for an organization to be self-reliant, but as a network of these dual power structures, so that this network doesn't need the hierarchical power structure, so that when the time comes, when that hierarchical power structure realizes we are a threat, and it decides that it doesn't want to give us any of its power anymore, and that we can no longer, take some of those little marginal pieces of power that it was giving us, that it just decides it doesn't want to give us those anymore. We need to be able to sustain ourselves. And what I just described is autonomy, if we do it right. That is the overall revolutionary strategy of the dual power movement. That requires us to take this process very seriously. You'll notice that that's not something we can just put together ad hoc, right? You're not going to just be able to do that with a bunch of affinity groups, because what I just described is going to have to be a continual process, a feedback process, wherein we have these organizations or institutions, you might call them, that go longer than any one individual. They have to go longer than even an individual lifetime. They're going to have to go for decades, maybe even centuries, as they continually subsume more and more power into horizontal structures instead. So what that means is organization is a necessity of dual power. So let's talk a little bit more about strategy.
So what this means in a lot of ways is that we need to adapt strategies, that formalize structures around us in ways that don't require maintenance. Let's think about a contrasting example. So, if we think of environmental racism, the way that whole communities of minorities have been crowded together in neighborhoods. This is a structurally racist reality that recreates inequality in the space, right? Now that redlining districts has already happened, and now that minorities have been largely lumped together in centralized places, the effects are ongoing. Nobody has to maintain anything for the systems which have been arranged racistly may just stay that way. As long as nobody interferes with those systems which have been organized racistly, then nobody has to do anything to maintain this recreating phenomenon, right? That is going to recreate itself over and over and over again in people's material conditions. So we ought to adopt those kinds of strategies, or the kinds of strategies that establish long-standing frameworks which will continue to do the intended function, even if nobody is still around to remember to do the thing or to think about accomplishing the thing. That we have structured certain things in such a way that now this is just how it is. And it doesn't require any kind of maintenance. I think that an example of something that might work like this No, never mind. That's not really a good example. Okay. That's okay. Let's get back to the video and let him finish the points, and I'll think more about that.
You'll notice that I'm using the word power a lot. I'm using this word power precisely because I think it gives us a more intersectional analysis. You'll notice that I'm not just talking about economics or class, right? That's because power is something that affects everybody in all kinds of different ways. White supremacy is a power structure. Capitalism is a kind of power structure. Patriarchy is a power structure. And when you start to kind of list out all of these possible power structures you might have to concern yourself with, you begin to realize that that's a really big list. It's not possible for any one organization to do all of them. The list is too big. So what you're going to find is that different organizations are going to focus on one or another of those hierarchies to fight, right? It's going to try to gain more and more of the power that was once in those hierarchies and absorb those into those horizontal structures instead. But here's the thing. Once you've got a whole bunch of organizations all focusing on one thing or the other, it seems like it would be really easy for them to kind of become splintered and aimless. So this is where the concept of federation or confederation enters. The idea is basically that you let everybody pursue the attack against whatever hierarchy they think is important in their life and to organize their group around it. But then you organize those groups together into networks. So historically, we've used this language of federation or confederation. These are words you're probably familiar with, but they might give you the wrong idea. What I'm really getting across here is that we have to coordinate all of these organizations together such that they fight on a common strategic front. And that common strategic front is anti-hierarchy. This is the common interest that everybody holds in common. And that is, hierarchy harms everyone in a different way. And in many ways, similarly, we all suffer from hierarchy in one way or another. And if we can join these networks of dual power structures together, we can form that common front against hierarchy. So I just want to say that this strategy I'm presenting, the part about anti-hierarchy and all of that, that's something that's kind of uniquely leftist. But the overall strategy of dual power, about absorbing these flows of power into an alternative structure that itself may eventually become a threat to the prevailing structures of society, is not something that only the left is concerned with. The right is also doing this. If you go do a little research, you'll find that white supremacists and ethno-nationalists of various kinds, they're creating dual power structures in all kinds of different places. Go research what is happening out in the rural areas of Washington. Go look at what's happening with Elohim City in Oklahoma. The white supremacists realized a long time ago that they need to make this alternative structure such that when the time came that they wanted to overthrow the state of things as they are, that they would be able to grow their own food, that they would have weapons training, that they would have communities to fall back on. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is that that really puts the clock on our efforts. This is urgent. This is not something we can wait around about. Because if we do, we have to understand that the right is already in the process of building up a right-wing dual power. And if we do nothing, it's very likely that if any form of rupture or civil conflict took place, that we would just lose because they've already got farms. They've already taught their people how to use firearms, how to infiltrate structures of power, and to learn about how they function. We have to do the same, and we have to do it rapidly because everything may depend on that fact.
Great. Anything else you think needs to be addressed?
Great video. That's one of the more dense ones. There's so much dense material, dense content in the idea of building dual power in general, right? And Anarch is only just touching the surface, really. Good. But that's a really fantastic series. I like the summary lectures. I think it does a really good job of going through the basics of anarchism, but also understanding the important ideas about prefigurative orientation, means ends unity. I really also like that there are a lot of specifics, right? That's one of the big qualms. One of the biggest critiques of anarchism is that anarchists often don't want to commit themselves to any kind of ideas about how we should organize or what things are going to look like or what kinds of decisions that we ought to make. And Anarch has helped to give us some real answers and some real good direction with how we might go about doing those things, making those kinds of decisions and establishing those kinds of thresholds. And that's one of the things that I continually stress is rather than looking for definitions, rather than thinking about concepts or ideas as things that are definable, right? That we understand we need to be fluid in all of our understandings of our material reality. Are we watching the My Journey into Anarchism video Wednesday? Probably. That sounds like yeah, that sounds like what we'll probably end up doing on Wednesday. But it's going to depend very much on what my weekend looks like. And by that I mean, if I spend the next 7 days, or 5, let's say, if I spend the next 5 days just grading essays and just, again, I spent most of my time trying to figure out who's cheating and not, right? Every time I have a new batch of submissions, I have to go through and spend hours. Anyways, I'll stop complaining about that one of these days. But if I spend the next 5 days just grading, then that's absolutely what we're going to do, because I won't have time to have thought of anything else. But if I have some time, I would like to start to jump into this idea of leftist perfectionism that I've teased about a whole bunch, but haven't really dove into yet, and how we go about quote unquote policing ourselves, or excuse me, ourselves, our organizations, and each other. And one of the first things that I would probably like to do is figure out a new term, because policing is not the right term. It's not the right word. That's not what we are supposed to be doing to each other, is policing. But I'm not sure what it is that we are supposed to be doing. There's a lot of stuff that I want to sit down and think about and work out. And if I have the time to do that, then that's what I'm going to want to talk about on Wednesday's stream, is leftist perfectionism and what that means, the extent to which it has value, the extent to which it backfires and does a disservice to us and interferes with our ability to think realistically, right? I want to contrast those kinds of ideas. So we'll see. We'll see where we end up with how things go. Also, if people keep dropping more awesome stuff in the Discord, or if there's any number of things might change that course. But I think that it's still a very good chance that I'm not going to have a whole lot of extra time. And that's what we'll just be doing, because that'll be an easy thing for me to just jump in and do without having any preparation or any plan for the stream. So, well, and speaking of, I don't really have anything else planned for today, so I might just wrap it up so that I can go get ready for my thing that's gonna be happening this afternoon. Something else that I want to put out there before I go is that I think that I would really like to take some time off from stream, but I don't think December is a good time for me to take off from streaming, so I plan to maintain my regular schedule for Wednesdays and Fridays throughout till the end of December. I might not stream the week the last week in December. No, it would be the second to last week, because there's another half week at the end of December after 25th. So, yeah, I'll get us through December, and I might try to take January off, or parts of January, maybe not the whole month, but a few weeks, just because I'm having trouble with everything that I'm trying to do in my personal life, and I really just kind of need a break, just to take a few weeks off, or maybe even a few days. Again, I'll revisit it later. I just wanted to go ahead and throw that out there that probably after the beginning of the year, I'll find a week or two that I take off that I'm just gonna try to get caught up on some of my stuff that I've got going on. But good. Let's get out of here. Let's get me out of here. I'm glad we got through these Anarch videos. There are a few of them I'm probably gonna want to go back and rewatch, or at least rewatch parts of it. That's what I was thinking about with the most recent one that we watched, the Revolutionary Roadmap, is one that I'll probably go back and revisit parts of that one. Parts of this one that we just watched, the Horizontal Organizations. And I'll probably want to go back and watch the whole how anarchism leads to emergence video. I thought that one was really quite fantastic. So because it's just really good content, really valuable. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that with any philosophy, you kind of don't get everything right off the first time you experience it. I reread philosophies all the time, and one of the things that I find is that in the rereading, I'm always surprised at how much more content there is that I just didn't really pick up on before. Let's go see Tina. It's been a long time since we've gone in to see Tina. They're just playing video games today, but that's okay. Usually I like to go into another stream that is talking about politics, but I've already hit the button. I like Tina. Let's go see Tina 2. If you're not familiar with Tina 2, they're awesome. They are also a very bells and whistles kind of streamer, I would say. I consider them to have lots of they do lots of other things other than just React content or news content. They've got bells and whistles. I don't have any bells and whistles. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm boring. But thank you so much for being here. It's good to see you all. Jane and Kaya Matara, I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Why am I not looking at where's the raid counter? Oh, there's the raid counter. Okay. There we go. Cool. Awesome. Well, we'll see you guys next time. Again, thank you for all of the amazing content in chat and for showing up and having some awesome things to say. I really appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Until then, be excellent to each other.